So we have a very striking gospel passage this morning from Luke. It's chapter 14. It's verses 25 through 33. It is about the requirements of discipleship. And so Jesus here, he proposes three devastating and inhuman requirements for becoming his disciple. Hate one's family, carry the cross, and give up all possessions. So the Greek word, we have to figure out what is actually meant by the word hate, because in our English language, we know what that means. It has a very visceral response. You know, I hate sexual abuse. I hate injustice. I hate the devil. All right, so we understand what that means. But here, it's a little bit different use of the word. The Greek word used for hate here is misio. It's the opposite of love. And it's translated into English as hate, but the word does not denote the emotions that we would think in English. So when we use the word hate in English, we know what that means. It's a very strong word. It has a visceral response in us. This word, misio, which is the Greek word that is being used in the gospel text, it denotes an attitude or an action or a mode of acting, not emotions. So in other words, for this particular word being used here, when Luke tells us that Jesus has said, unless you hate mother and father, spouse and children, brothers and sisters, and yourself, it's not how one feels towards those people, but rather one's effective attitude when it comes to a choice for a different group. So in English, we could probably use the word prefer. It's more readily understood, and it's like when teenagers, you know, teenagers hate their parents, right? You guys know that, right? Okay, teenagers hate their parents. What's that mean? Okay, it doesn't mean they really hate their parents, like in the English language, hate. It means they prefer their own peer groups to the parents. Oh, yeah, okay, so it makes sense now, right? Teenagers prefer to hang out with their own friends than their parents, right? Yes. Okay, that's what is meant by there, prefer. So in this context, to hate one's family means I make a rational decision for prioritizing Jesus as my number one value and singular primary motive for all the actions in my life. The English word hate does not really express what Jesus meant. So it is, what he meant was to love him first. That's really what he meant to say was, well, he probably meant love me first. Make me the first person that you use as your motive for decision making. So a true disciple, they love Jesus more than anything or anybody else. So in light of this requirement, we should be asking ourselves, do I love mother or father, son or daughter, husband or wife more than God? And the answer is supposed to be no. I don't love mother or father or brother or sister or spouse or children more than God. But the answer is probably yes, I do love them more than God. Probably, if we're being honest. And so therein lies the revelation of the radical nature of discipleship. It's not easy to be a disciple. And that's probably what Luke was trying to get across to us. And that's why there's language that is being used here to get our attention. So these words of Jesus, they should not disturb or sadden or offend us, since we want Jesus' love, or we want the love of Jesus to be our primary motive in our lives, because that's what leads us, of course, to eternal salvation, but also leads us to inner peace, and he is the source of a great calm within us and our own interior spiritual life. And so for the disciple, not even personal family relationships are to be permitted to force us to place God as anything less than first. Okay, God is supposed to be first in our lives, and this is what the disciple has to realize, and that's why there's a calculation of risk or cost in this gospel passage. Now, there's something else going on here, of course, in the cultural context. That also plays a role in this first requirement of hating one's family in order to be Jesus' disciple, in that to prefer another group to your own kin, in other words, Jesus' group and his disciples, to prefer to hang out with them versus your own family, there's a cost in that. It's to sacrifice your kin. It's to look for a new group of economic survival because you no longer have your family to fall back on. Now remember that in the Middle East at the time, still in the Middle East, the number one rule is family first. So a choice for discipleship meant a choice for allegiance to a new family. Allegiance to Jesus and his new family of disciples meant you ceased networking with family members, which would constitute your social and economic death. So following Jesus as his disciple meant cutting all ties with your family and kin. Now we have to recall again that this tight-knit family life of Middle Eastern culture. So a couple things about that. One's ideal marriage partner was your first cousin. Sons, married and single, they remained with the father in his house. One is responsible to the family first, and everyone is in your business and controls your life. That's normal for the culture of the time. So in this context, then, this new family of Jesus may sound very inviting, liberating, indeed, even exhilarating. There is a freedom being offered from the usual norm, but there is a price to pay for such freedom, the cross, and he mentions that. The disciple who cuts ties with the original family will lose his social network, thus losing the means of making a living. So discipleship becomes an economic cross in this context. Jesus and the disciples' livelihood, it depends on hospitality of others, which is risky since, of course, hospitality in the culture of the time was exclusively offered to strangers. So in other words, you can't go back to mom or dad or your cousin or your brother or sister for when you fall in hard times. You're on your own. You've chosen a new family, and it's Jesus and his disciples. So regardless of any culture, the contemporary disciple, that would be us, will experience some human suffering as it is inescapable in our human existence. And so when we look at the cross is not a tragedy. It was a means of torture and a very great symbol of war and suffering as the Romans used it. But with Jesus, as he does, he takes everything bad and he makes it good, or he draws good out of everything bad. The cross is not a tragedy anymore. Okay? It's rather a means of sanctification, becoming one with Christ himself and winning heaven as a reward. We should not have to be afraid of the cross anymore. And therefore, a potential disciple must seriously and wisely calculate the risks and costs of discipleship. There is a cost of being Jesus' disciple, but not in building towers or opposing armies, but rather in gaining Christ himself, as well as happiness, inner peace of soul, and eternal salvation. True wisdom does actually lead one to accept the radical nature of discipleship, placing love of God first in our lives and changing our attitudes about suffering from avoidance to acceptance. And so similar to the imprudence of the tower or the army, Jesus adds that in the same way. It's the third one that he adds. Anyone who thinks they can follow him without renouncing all of his possessions is also foolish. So what's he doing there? He's cautioning against the emotional attachments to the material world. He's cautioning against the emotional attachments to the material world. How emotionally attached are we to material things? How many times do we find ourselves saying, I love my dog, I love my car, I love cheesecake, I love chocolate? It doesn't sound like God is in there. Okay, we are very attached to the material world. And so he's cautioning us that the disciple, if you're going to be able to follow Jesus, and if it's going to feel good, if it's going to feel like joy and freedom, you have to be unencumbered. Our hearts have to be completely unencumbered by the material world. We cannot be emotionally attached to things of the earth. Otherwise, this discipleship thing is going to feel like a burden. I mean, obviously, if we were to understand what Jesus said in the English language, you can't be my disciple unless you hate your family and pick up your cross and renounce all your possessions, we'd be like, no thanks. I'll go another way. That does not sound inviting. Right? We have to understand what discipleship is offering us. And until we play in the world long enough, we find out that we're really not going to be happy anywhere else. But this way of life that Christ is offering, this way of discipleship, sure, there's going to be suffering, sure, there's some difficulty involved, but it pays out much better than anything in the world. Nothing else can offer us eternal life. Nothing else can offer the availability or the opportunity to be at peace within ourselves when everything else around us is stupid and crazy. This is what discipleship offers us. When everything is nuts, whether there's injustice, where there's all kinds of things that are just wrong and dumb, that are against God, that are against our own creation, we have this way of discipleship. And by following Jesus Christ in discipleship, there is this present reward and an eternal reward. This is why we need to realize what we're getting into. And yeah, most of us, our godparents or our parents stood in place for us and said, baptize my child so that they can come to know Jesus. And we didn't have that choice because our free will doesn't kick in until about 13 years old, and the age of reason doesn't start till about age 7. But nonetheless, somebody thought it was a good idea to introduce us to Jesus when we were still infants, because there's something else going on there. The supernatural life of Jesus Christ is being infused into the soul. Without that supernatural life of Jesus Christ being infused into a soul, the soul lacks protection from evil. Somebody knew there was evil in the world, and that somebody knew that they want to protect their children from it. So they baptize them. And so involved in that baptism is the first step. Here's Jesus. I want to make him my friend. I want to follow him. And I want to follow him all the way through the cross to eternal life for my own resurrected glory. And so discipleship, again, is not easy. But Christ himself is worth it. And though there is suffering in following Jesus, he does give us grace to be faithful and successful, prosper the work of our hands, as the psalm reads. So in light of today's gospel, we are all disciples. We have been taught that we are disciples of Jesus Christ. But do we take that phrase for granted? Am I really a disciple of Jesus Christ? Am I really committed to this endeavor? And if I am a disciple of Jesus Christ, can I be a better disciple of Jesus Christ? And how?